Jake was always an adventurous guy. At 27, he had a thirst for nature and solitude that led him to some of the most remote camping spots imaginable. His latest plan was a solo camping trip deep in the Silver Pines forest, a dense and isolated area known for its untamed beauty. Friends warned him about the eerie reputation of the place, stories of people who had ventured into the forest and never returned, but Jake brushed them off, dismissing them as mere local folklore. He packed his gear, grabbed his tent, and set off for a weekend in the wilderness. The first day passed uneventfully. The forest was calm, the air fresh, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. Jake enjoyed the solitude, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world. By late afternoon, he found a spot near a small clearing to set up camp. He pitched his tent, gathered some firewood, and started a campfire. As night fell, the forest became eerily quiet. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an unnatural silence that weighed on Jake's senses. He shook it off, attributing it to being alone in such a remote place. The night dragged on, and despite the warmth of the fire, a strange chill settled in the air. Around midnight, as Jake was dozing off in his tent, he heard something outside. A soft rustling, as if something or someone was moving around his camp. He quickly unzipped the tent and shone his flashlight into the dark. The beam of light caught nothing but the surrounding trees and bushes swaying in the wind. He told himself it was just an animal and went back to his tent. An hour later, the same noise returned. This time, it was accompanied by faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing, as if carried by the wind. Jake's heart raced, and he strained to listen, trying to convince himself it was the breeze or the distant echo of wildlife. But the whispers grew louder, unintelligible, but clearly human. Suddenly, his campfire, which had been burning steadily, flickered and went out, plunging his campsite into darkness. Jake grabbed his flashlight, but it flickered too, the batteries seemingly drained in an instant. Panic began to creep in as the whispering grew louder, circling his tent. He could hear footsteps now, crunching through the leaves, slow and deliberate, getting closer with each second. Without thinking, Jake shot out of his tent, armed only with a hunting knife. He shone the weak beam of his flashlight into the trees, the light bouncing off trunks and bushes, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped, but the whispering continued, closer as if someone was standing right behind him. Jake spun around, but saw nothing. His skin crawled, the hair on his neck standing on end. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. A shadow, darker than the night itself, slinking between the trees. His heart raced as he followed it with his flashlight. The beam caught the outline of a figure, just barely visible, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs and a head that seemed too large for its body. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He felt rooted to the spot, unable to move. The figure shifted slightly, and the whispering intensified. The words were still incomprehensible, but they seemed to seep into his mind, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread. Without warning, the figure darted toward him, moving faster than anything humanly possible. Jake bolted. He ran through the trees, stumbling over roots and branches, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he could hear the footsteps again, keeping pace with him, no matter how fast he ran. The whispers grew louder, now directly in his ear, as if the figure was right behind him. In his panic, Jake tripped and fell, rolling down a steep incline. He landed hard, his body battered and bruised, but he forced himself to get up. He had lost his flashlight in the fall, and now the darkness was absolute. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the whispers, which had stopped. For a moment, he thought he was safe, that whatever had been chasing him had given up. But then, he saw it again, standing just a few feet away, the shadowy figure, its shape more defined now. Its face, or what should have been a face, was an empty void, a hollow space where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Jake backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure reached out, its long, bony finger stretching toward him. Jake screamed and ran again, not knowing where he was going, just desperate to get away. He could hear the figure following him, its footsteps heavier now, almost thundering in his ears. He ran until his lungs burned, until his legs gave out, and he collapsed in a heap on the forest floor. He lay there too exhausted to move, waiting for the end, but it never came. The footsteps stopped, and the forest fell silent once more. Jake looked around, but the figure was gone. The whispers had faded, leaving only the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. When morning came, Jake dragged himself back to his campsite. His gear was untouched, but the fire pit was cold, and the eerie feeling from the night before still lingered in the air. He packed up his things and left the forest as quickly as he could, swearing never to return.